This is it? Remember that, the Washington Post, democracy dies in the darkness? No, your IQ dies with the Washington Post and the New York Times reading this. So, as I said, the Democrats have been driven to insanity defending the indefensible over and over and over again. Now, we've seen this before, and I'm going to put up some examples for you of the Democrats so losing their minds that they are on the side of everything America isn't. I've got that. But before we get to that, I want to provide the latest example, which is the termination of the life of savage Qasem Soleimani, one of the world's most dangerous people, a terrorist, a savage. And, I got an email this weekend, and the lady who emailed me was right. She said, don't call Soleimani an animal. It's actually an insult to animals. And she's right. Most animals are actually pretty loving, especially. So Soleimani, it's a disgrace to animals to call him an animal. So we'll stick with savage. She was absolutely correct on that one. Soleimani is now dead thanks to the decisions made by Donald Trump and the heroic actions of our military, which of course are on the front lines of this. Now, of course, leave it to the Democrats to try and defend this. Defend the death of an Iranian commander with the blood of, at a minimum, folks, a minimum 600 Americans on his hand, which we know about directly. But as Matt Palumbo has up at our site, 1 in 5 deaths in Iraq are thought to be attributed to Soleimani and his people and their terrorist engineering. This is an unabashedly good thing that this guy is leaving Iraq in a body bag. There's no question about that among sane people, but the Democrats aren't sane anymore. So, people in Iraq who have been subjected to Iranian tyranny in their efforts to influence Iraqi governance, and an Iraqi population that's probably yearning to be free like most people around the world are, some of them celebrated. And Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, after the death of Soleimani, tweeted out this video of Iranians running through the street and celebrating. New York Times wasn't having that, Joe. The New York Times cannot have the story out there because remember, don't forget, the media and the New York Times, the liberal activist Times, are telling you a story, not the story. So what is a story the New York Times wants to tell you? That they're not celebrating the Iraqis. This isn't a good thing. So here's the headline. This is an actual headline from the New York Slimes. A video tweeted by Pompeo was authentic. However, his description was misleading.
Oh, come on. Bite me.
No, not come on. This is real. This actually happened. This is the New York Times. Joe, remember, they got to get out ahead of the story, the facts. The facts are what Pompeo tweeted was authentic. It was a video of Iraqis celebrating the fact that this Iranian terrorist who was trying to infiltrate the Iraqi government and influence Iraqi policy in the direction away from freedom. Iraqis celebrated this guy was dead. Nobody's questioning the authenticity of this, but the New York Times can't have that story out there. Why? Ask yourself, why? Because, Joe, the story of Iraqis celebrating in the street that the death of an Iranian terrorist might positively benefit their country and reflect positively on Donald Trump cannot possibly be told. The New York Times has to run interference. Remember the New York Times. The New York Times, the defenders of the communist Soviet Union for decades. The New York Times for decades who defended the anti-American crowd. As David Horowitz calls these people, they're the anti-communists. David Horowitz has always said that. In other words, like we were anti-communists and freedom fighters, so the New York Times and others are anti-communists. They're against us. They're just against people who are for freedom, like these Iraqis. So here's this from the actual piece. Here's a quote from the piece. This is real. Again, from the New York Times. Again, I asked this morning on Fox and Friends, and I'll ask again about the Times and the liberals. What side are you guys on, man? Listen to this quote. Witnesses in Iraq said that only a handful of men carrying Iraqi flags had run. Not danced, Joe. They got to be clear. They'd run, but they weren't dancing. So Pompeo, who said they were dancing in the streets, it wasn't a dance. They could not verify the dance. It wasn't an official, a jig, a rumba. It wasn't the merengue. It wasn't the pachanga. I'm not a real dance guy. It reminds me of Dirty Dancing. Good idea, Neil. The pachanga, or whatever it was. It wasn't a dance. It was a run. The New York Times has to be specific, Joe. They go on. Along a road, while the voice of a man speaking near the camera was heard praising the killing of Soleimani of Iran in a targeted U.S. airstrike on Friday at Baghdad airport. The New York Times wants to be crystal clear, Joe. It was a run. It wasn't a dance.
That's important, Dan.
Up to the Times. To me and you, we're laughing like this is it. Remember that, the Washington Post, democracy dies in the darkness? No, your IQ dies with the Washington Post and the New York Times reading this. This is a serious article, folks. Iraqis are celebrating the death of this Iranian who's trying to take away their freedom in their country. And the New York Times writes a serious story that, no, even though the video is authentic, this was clearly a run, not a dance. How do you think this resonates with average Americans? That a guy who is unquestionably, at a minimum, has the blood on his hands of over 600 Americans, that we took him out. And how do you think it resonates in middle America when the New York Times' biggest concern, Joe, is it was a run, not a dance. It was not a dance. It was not the rumba. This was clearly a run. That's your story?
You just heard the Dan Bongino Show. You can also get Dan's podcasts on iTunes or SoundCloud. And follow Dan on Twitter 24/7 @DBongino.